She went to tell the millionaire CEO she was pregnant, only to catch him cheating. 5 years later, he met their sons. Clara had never been so sure of anything as she was the night she decided to go to Luca and tell him the truth. She spent the afternoon sitting at the small kitchen table in her apartment, staring at the folded piece of paper that held the first ultrasound image of the baby growing inside her. The little shape was grainy and faint, but to her, it felt more real than anything else in her life. She had rehearsed what she would say over and over, imagining every possible way he might react, hoping that the man she had fallen in love with, the one who held her close when she was scared, who had whispered that he couldn't imagine a future without her, would still be the one who opened the door. She chose her simplest dress, pale blue with buttons down the front, and tied her wavy brown hair back so she would look composed, determined, the way she needed to be. The city was already sinking into twilight when she arrived at his building, the lights in the lobby glowing soft and golden against the glass. She felt her heart racing as she stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. Every floor she passed made her breath feel tighter in her chest, and by the time she reached his door, she thought she might be sick. She closed her eyes and told herself it was too late to turn back. He deserved to know. She deserved to say it. When she knocked, there was no answer at first. She waited, listening for footsteps, but all she heard was the muffled beat of music coming from inside. She lifted her hand to knock again, then realized the door wasn't latched. A strange chill slid through her, but she tried to ignore it as she pushed the door open and stepped into the familiar living room with its polished floors and the clean, expensive smell she used to love. She called his name softly, not wanting to startle him, but there was no reply. The music grew louder as she moved deeper into the penthouse, and that was when she noticed the bedroom door slightly open, a narrow slice of light spilling across the hall. She stood there for a moment, willing herself to be wrong about the dread that had started to crawl up her spine. Slowly, she walked forward and laid her hand on the doorframe. What she saw inside knocked the air from her lungs. Luca was standing near the bed, his blonde hair tousled, his shirt half unbuttoned. And he wasn't alone. A woman she'd never seen before was leaning into him, her mouth near his ear, her hands on his chest like she belonged there. Clara felt her vision narrow to a pinpoint, her fingers going numb where they rested against the wood. For a long, silent moment, no one noticed her. She could have turned and left without either of them ever knowing she'd been there. She thought about the envelope in her bag, about the heartbeat she had seen flicker on the screen just days before. She thought about all the nights she'd spent wondering if she was enough, if he really meant all those promises. And she knew that if she stayed 1 second longer, she would break apart in a way she would never be able to repair. She took one step back, her breath caught somewhere between a sob and a gasp. She wanted to scream, to demand that he look at her and see what he was throwing away. But instead she did the only thing she could manage. She turned around, walked back through the apartment that still smelled like his cologne, and closed the door behind her as quietly as she could. When she stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, she felt the tears finally spill over. She told herself she would not look back. She would not let herself wonder what he would have said if she had spoken first. When Clara left Luca's building that night, she didn't feel anger, not yet. What she felt was a cold, unsteady emptiness that followed her all the way down the sidewalk. She clutched the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles ached, the envelope with the ultrasound pressing hard against her ribs as if to remind her it was still real, even if everything else had dissolved. She walked for blocks without thinking about where she was going. The streetlights blurred through the tears she couldn't hold back anymore, and when she finally stopped, she realized she was standing at the bus stop near her old neighborhood, the one she had moved away from when she thought her life was about to become something bigger and brighter. She waited in the dark, shivering in the thin blue dress that now felt like a costume she'd worn for someone else's sake. When the bus pulled up, she climbed aboard and sat near the back, pressing her forehead against the cool window. All around her, other passengers were dozing, scrolling through their phones, living in the soft oblivion of late-night routines. For a moment she wished she could be any one of them, someone who didn't have a secret growing inside, someone who wasn't already imagining what it would be like to explain to a child why their father wasn't there. The next morning she called her manager at the flower shop and told her she wouldn't be coming in. She couldn't bear the thought of pretending to smile for customers, of arranging cheerful bouquets when all she wanted to do was curl up and disappear. She spent the day in bed, the curtains drawn tight against the daylight. Now and then she would touch her belly, still flat and unchanged, and feel a wave of guilt that she hadn't managed to tell Luca before everything fell apart. But each time she closed her eyes, she saw him in that room with someone else, and her chest would seize with something she didn't have a name for yet. For the next week, she didn't answer his calls. When he finally realized she was avoiding him, he left messages, brief, clipped voicemails that never asked where she had gone or whether she was okay. Instead, he only asked when she planned to come back to finish a conversation she had never started. He sounded impatient, like she had inconvenienced him by vanishing without explanation. Each time she listened to his voice, something hardened a little more inside her, like ice spreading under her ribs. She deleted the messages and turned off her phone. Late at night, when she lay awake in the silent apartment, she replayed every moment of their relationship, searching for the clue she must have missed. She thought about the evenings he would cancel plans because of work emergencies, the times he pulled away when she asked questions about the future. She had wanted so badly to believe those things didn't mean anything. That underneath his ambition was a man who felt what she felt. But now, the doubt was impossible to ignore. She wondered if she had always been alone in her hope. It was during those nights that the resolve started to grow inside her, slow and painful like a bone-mending wrong. She knew she couldn't stay in the city where she'd built all her dreams around him. She couldn't walk past the restaurants where they'd had quiet dinners or the bookstores where he'd picked out novels for her to read. Every street felt tainted with memories she no longer wanted. By the end of the week, she had made her decision. She would leave without telling him. He had chosen the life he wanted. Now she would choose hers. Clara packed her few belongings into cardboard boxes, taping them shut with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She left the envelope with the ultrasound at the very bottom of her suitcase, folded between two sweaters she rarely wore. She told herself she would look at it again when she was ready to stop feeling like she had failed. She didn't know where she would go yet, only that it had to be somewhere she could start over before the baby came. She called a moving company and booked a small truck, then sat alone in the quiet kitchen until dawn, her palms pressed flat against the table, breathing through the ache in her throat. When morning finally came, she stood up and felt something like relief. It was the first moment in days that she didn't feel entirely powerless. The new town wasn't remarkable in any obvious way, but that was precisely why Clara had chosen it. It was a place no one would think to look for her, a cluster of quiet streets lined with narrow houses and small shops that closed early every evening. She found an apartment over a bakery that smelled of warm bread at dawn and vanilla by afternoon. The space was simple, a single bedroom with faded curtains, a living room just big enough for a second-hand sofa, and a kitchen with a chipped tile counter where she set down her single box of dishes. The first night she lay in bed listening to the murmur of the street below and tried to convince herself she felt safe. But as the hours crawled by, the silence pressed down on her until it felt like she might suffocate under the weight of it. In the morning she walked to the grocery store 2 blocks away and bought only what she needed for the day. She didn't want full cupboards or anything that might suggest she planned to stay long. It was easier to pretend this was temporary, that she might still wake up one morning and discover the last week had been a dream. But then she would feel the smallest swell of her belly under her hand, and she would remember with a clarity so sharp it made her chest ache, there was no going back. She was alone, and soon there would be no way to hide it from the world. She found work at a small florist's on the corner, where the owner, a kindly woman named Margaret, didn't ask many questions beyond whether Clara knew how to keep hydrangeas from wilting. She learned to wrap bouquets with fingers that still shook when she wasn't paying attention and to smile in a way that seemed believable. Margaret never pressed her for details about why she had moved there or what she was running from. Sometimes, when Clara thought her heart might splinter from the effort of pretending she was fine, that quiet acceptance felt like the only thing holding her together. Each evening she came home exhausted, her feet sore from standing behind the counter, and she would collapse on the couch and stare at the ceiling until darkness filled the little apartment. She kept the envelope with the ultrasound in the drawer beside her bed, tucked under a folded scarf she never wore. Most nights she didn't look at it. But some nights, when the loneliness became too much to swallow, she would pull it out and run her fingers over the blurry image of the baby growing inside her. She would try to imagine what it would feel like to hold that tiny body in her arms and know that, for the first time in her life, she had someone who belonged entirely to her. Sometimes she caught herself thinking about Luca, about whether he ever wondered what had happened to her. She would picture him sitting in his glass-walled office high above the city, his expression distant and unbothered as he signed contracts worth more than she would ever see in her lifetime. She imagined him forgetting her name, replacing her with someone easier, someone who never asked for more than he was willing to give. But then she would remember the way he had looked at her in those first months, when everything between them had felt bright and improbable, and she would feel her chest squeeze around the ache of it all. She told herself she had to stop remembering, but the memories had a way of rising up when she was weakest, insistent and uninvited. As the weeks passed, the shape of her life began to shift around her growing belly. The neighbors learned her name and started to wave when they saw her in the mornings. The woman who ran the bakery downstairs began slipping her extra pastries at the end of the day, saying she needed the energy now that she was eating for two. Clara thanked her, but she never offered more than a shy smile in return. She was grateful for the kindness, but she couldn't bring herself to let anyone get too close. She was still learning how to hold herself together, to wake up each day and choose to stay instead of running again. At night, when the world finally fell quiet, she would lie with her hands on her stomach and whisper all the things she was too afraid to say out loud in daylight. She would tell her baby that it was loved, that she was sorry it had to begin life in the middle of so much pain. She promised that no matter what happened, she would never leave, never choose her own fear over what her child needed. She knew the baby couldn't hear her yet, but it made her feel less alone to say it, to believe that her words might root themselves in a tiny, unseen heart beating just beneath her skin. And though she didn't know what the future looked like anymore, she understood for the first time that she was stronger than she had ever believed she could be. The morning Clara went into labor began like any other, with the smell of fresh bread drifting up through the floorboards and the first pale light creeping between the curtains. She was already awake when the sky began to change color, lying on her side and watching the shadows shift across the wall. The baby had been restless all night, turning and stretching in a way that left her breathless and aching. She thought it was just another sign that the end of her pregnancy was near, another small discomfort to endure in the long list she had stopped complaining about weeks ago. She moved carefully to sit up, pressing her hand against the place where the sharpest pressure pulsed through her lower back, and told herself it was nothing more than fatigue. She made tea the way she did every morning, standing barefoot in the kitchen with one hand braced on the counter as she waited for the water to boil. But by the time she'd carried the mug back to the couch, a deep, rolling pain began to bloom low in her belly, spreading outward in waves so strong she had to bite down on her lip to keep from crying out. The first contraction passed, and for a moment she thought it must be false labor, something that would fade if she lay down and tried to breathe through it. But when the next one came, sharper and longer, she felt a kind of cold clarity settle over her. This was happening. She didn't panic, not at first. She moved methodically around the apartment, checking the small hospital bag she had packed and repacked dozens of times. She called Margaret at the flower shop to say she wouldn't be in. Her voice was so calm that for a moment she almost convinced herself she wasn't afraid. But when she ended the call and set the phone down, her hand was shaking so badly she had to press it against her chest to steady it. She took shallow breaths, her mind racing with all the things she hadn't prepared for, all the ways she still felt too alone to face what was coming. By the time she called a taxi, the contractions were so close together that she could barely speak in full sentences. She locked the apartment door behind her and paused in the hallway, one hand gripping the banister as another wave of pain bent her forward. When it passed, she straightened and kept walking. There was no one to lean on, no familiar voice to promise that she would be okay, but she told herself she could do this because there was no other choice. The driver was a middle-aged man who glanced in the rearview mirror with wide, worried eyes when he realized what was happening. He offered to call an ambulance, but she shook her head and told him to just keep driving. She didn't trust her voice not to break if she said more. She stared out the window, clutching her bag to her chest, and tried to focus on anything but the tightening ache that kept stealing her breath. The city rolled by in a blur of morning traffic and sunlit brick buildings, none of it registering as real. At the hospital, everything began to move too quickly to follow. A nurse brought a wheelchair she didn't want, but she was too weak to protest. Voices blurred around her as they checked her in, asked her name, asked who to call. She didn't have an answer for that. She tried to focus on the pattern of the ceiling tiles as they wheeled her into a labor room, each square a little more crooked than the last. She wanted to close her eyes and wake up somewhere else, somewhere she wasn't alone in this moment. But when the next contraction hit, she realized that all she could do was survive each wave, one breath at a time. Hours passed. She didn't remember them clearly. She only remembered the pain and the hollow ache of wishing she had someone's hand to hold, someone to tell her she was strong when she felt like she was breaking. Once or twice, she thought about Luca, and a flash of something like grief burned through her, but she forced herself to let it go. This was her life now, her choice, her child. No one else could take that from her, and no one else could save her from it. When the baby finally arrived, the room fell quiet except for the thin, shocked cry of a newborn. She turned her head, tears already sliding across her cheeks, and saw the nurse lift a tiny, perfect boy into the air. He was red-faced and squalling, and in that instant she felt something tear open inside her, something that was equal parts love and terror. They laid him against her chest, and she pressed her palm over his warm back, feeling the small, frantic heartbeat that belonged to her alone. She whispered that she was there, that he was safe, that no matter how much she didn't know about being a mother, she would never leave him. Later, when the nurses left them alone in the quiet, she studied every detail of his face, the delicate arch of his brow, the faint blonde hair that already curled against his damp forehead, the tiny clenched fists that rested against her skin. He looked so much like Luca that for a moment her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't let the memory win. She forced herself to look past the resemblance and see only her son, new and unbroken by anything that had come before. She pressed a kiss to the crown of his head and whispered his name, promising herself she would give him a life defined not by what she had lost, but by everything she still had the power to give. Clara spent the first weeks after bringing her son home in a kind of fragile suspension, as if any wrong movement might shatter the small, precious world she was trying to build around them. The apartment felt both too big and too small, crowded with the quiet that settled over every surface when she was too exhausted to think. The baby, she had named him Eli, was a gentle soul in the daytime, content to watch the shifting light on the ceiling as she carried him from room to room. But at night he cried in long, desperate wails that made her heart clench with something more powerful than fear, something closer to the deep ache of being responsible for another life in a way she hadn't fully understood until she held him in her arms. In the hours between midnight and dawn, she would rock him in the chair by the window, her cheek resting against the top of his soft hair while she hummed lullabies she could barely remember learning. Sometimes she thought of the way Luca's voice had sounded in the dark, low and warm when he used to tell her stories of his childhood to help her fall asleep. She imagined what it would have felt like to hear that voice beside her now, to share the weight of every worry that seemed to double in her mind once the world outside went quiet. But when the thoughts became too heavy, she would focus on Eli's breathing, the small hitches and sighs that reminded her he was real, that she wasn't dreaming her way through this new life. In the daylight she tried to keep everything orderly because it made her feel like she had control. She lined up Eli's tiny clothes in neat stacks on the dresser. She kept bottles washed and ready, burp cloths folded into tidy squares, diapers counted and arranged by size. It was her way of convincing herself she could be enough, that she could build stability out of nothing more than routine and fierce determination. Margaret came by more than once to check on her, bringing bags of groceries and gently teasing her for refusing to ask for help. Clara would always smile and say she was fine, though she knew the older woman could see straight through her calm tone and tired face. Some afternoons she would walk Eli in his stroller through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, grateful for the distraction of motion. The fresh air seemed to ease his restlessness, and she would pause beneath trees just coming into leaf and watch the breeze ruffle the fine hair on his head. She wondered what he would look like in a year, in 5, in 10. Whether she would always be able to protect him from the loneliness she still felt curled inside her ribs like an old bruise. She told herself that even if she couldn't give him a father, she would give him everything else, a mother who never disappeared, who never let her own fear dictate his future. At night, when Eli finally drifted into exhausted sleep, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of all the ways she was different now. She was no longer the woman who had stood in Luca's apartment doorway, hoping he would choose her. She was no longer the woman who believed that love alone was enough to anchor someone like him. She had learned in those long, silent nights how to rely on no one but herself, how to draw strength from the simple fact that she had survived the things that once would have destroyed her. Still, there were moments when she would catch herself imagining how it could have been if Luca had known about Eli from the beginning. She pictured him kneeling beside the crib, one hand resting over the blanket, his eyes soft in a way she had only seen a handful of times. She wondered if he would have loved their son enough to stay, or if he would have found reasons to leave, the way he had left her that night without even realizing it. Each time her thoughts wandered there, she forced herself back to the present, to the warmth of Eli's small body in her arms, to the promise she made every morning when she woke and saw his face, that she would never let regret steal what little peace they had found together. She began to measure time not by weeks or months but by the tiny milestones that marked Eli's growth, a first smile in the early dawn, a hesitant laugh that made her heart twist with wonder, the way his hand would curl instinctively around her finger as if he understood even now that she was his safe place. These moments were the proof that she was no longer living for someone else's approval. She was living for the boy who looked up at her with clear blue eyes and trusted her without question, the boy who was hers in a way nothing else had ever been. And in the quiet hours when exhaustion finally claimed her, she would fall asleep with her hand resting lightly over his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath, and believe, if only for a little while, that everything broken could one day be mended. Clara was almost surprised by how quickly a year passed once she stopped counting the days she had been without Luca. It wasn't that she no longer thought of him, because she did, in small unexpected moments that stole her breath when she wasn't prepared. She would catch herself remembering the way his hand had felt on her back as they crossed busy streets, or the way he used to touch her cheek when he was trying to convince her everything would be fine. But the memories no longer felt like open wounds. They had dulled into something she could carry without flinching, something she could tuck away when Eli needed all her attention. Eli was nearly walking by the time the first warm days of spring arrived. He would pull himself up on the coffee table and look back over his shoulder with an expression so mischievous she often had to laugh before she could scold him. His hair had lightened to the same bright blonde she used to run her fingers through when she and Luca were still pretending the future would be simple. He had his father's eyes too, a clear unwavering blue that seemed too old for someone so small. Sometimes when she held him close, she wondered whether he would grow to look even more like the man she had loved. She didn't know if that thought comforted her or scared her, but she learned not to question it too much. Their days had settled into an imperfect but steady rhythm. In the morning she would lift Eli from his crib and carry him to the kitchen where she would set him in his high chair with a piece of banana while she made coffee. He babbled constantly, a stream of half-words and eager laughter that made the quiet apartment feel less empty. She liked to imagine that even though he was too young to understand, he knew she had built every part of their life around making sure he never felt abandoned. Sometimes she caught herself whispering promises to him under her breath, telling him that no matter how hard it got, she would never choose to leave. She would never make him wonder why he wasn't enough. She had gone back to the flower shop part-time once Eli was old enough to stay with Margaret's niece during the day. The first morning she left him she had to stand on the front steps for nearly 10 minutes, breathing through the guilt and fear that pressed against her chest. But when she returned that evening and saw him waving his little hands in greeting, she realized he was stronger than she gave him credit for. They were both learning to trust the world again in small, tentative steps. There were nights when the loneliness caught her off guard, when she would wake to the sound of Eli shifting in his crib and feel her throat tighten with the longing to share the simple sweetness of their life with someone else. She imagined how it would feel to have another adult voice in the dark, someone to whisper that she was doing a good job, that she hadn't ruined everything by choosing to walk away instead of begging Luca to stay. In those moments she would tiptoe to Eli's side and rest her hand against his back, grounding herself in the warmth of his breathing. The weight of her own choices never completely disappeared, but she was learning how to live with it without letting it define her. When Eli began taking his first unsteady steps, she thought her heart might burst from the mixture of pride and sorrow that welled up inside her. He would grin at her, arms outstretched for balance, and toddle across the room with all the determination of someone who didn't know yet how easy it was to fall. She found herself whispering encouragements, soft urgent reminders that she was right there, that he was safe, that she would catch him every time. Watching him grow into himself, she realized that maybe this was what strength really looked like. Not pretending she didn't hurt, not trying to erase the past, but showing up every day anyway, even when it felt like she had nothing left to give. One evening as she rocked him before bed, the last light of sunset slipping through the thin curtains, she looked down at his sleepy face and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. She felt hopeful. Not for the life she had once imagined, but for the one she was creating now, a life that didn't depend on anyone else choosing to stay. She pressed a kiss to the top of his head and closed her eyes, breathing in the sweet clean scent of his hair, and for the first time she believed that maybe she had made the right choice after all. Maybe loving him this fiercely was enough. Maybe it always had been. Clara always believed that if Luca were ever to reappear in her life, she would know in advance somehow, that she would sense his presence in the air the way you can feel the first thunder of a coming storm. But when it finally happened, it was without warning, so sudden and ordinary that for one stunned moment she thought she must be imagining him. She had been walking home from the park, Eli's small hand wrapped trustingly around her fingers as he chattered about the pigeons he'd been chasing. She had paused outside the corner grocer to rummage in her bag for her wallet, and when she looked up, he was simply there, standing across the narrow street with his hands in the pockets of his expensive coat, watching them with a stillness that made her heart lurch sideways in her chest. For a moment the world seemed to narrow to a pinprick of sound and color. She registered the faint honk of a distant horn, the breeze lifting the hair from her shoulders, the warmth of Eli's palm in her own, but everything else dropped away as she took in the sight of Luca's face. He hadn't changed as much as she expected. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes she didn't remember, and his hair was a little shorter than when she'd last seen him, but the expression on his face was the one she knew too well, an uneasy mix of determination and regret that made her feel unsteady on her feet. She realized she hadn't moved or spoken. Eli tugged her hand, asking in a curious voice who the man was, and the sound snapped her out of the suspended moment. She wanted to turn and walk away before Luca could cross the street, before he could speak and unravel all the fragile peace she'd built in the years since she'd left. But her body wouldn't obey her. She stood frozen as he stepped off the curb and approached, each of his careful strides closing the distance she had convinced herself was unbridgeable. When he reached them, he stopped just a foot away, close enough that she could see the way his throat worked as he swallowed, the way his eyes shifted down to Eli and then back to her face as if he wasn't sure which of them he should look at first. For a long moment no one spoke. She felt Eli press against her leg, sensing the tension that vibrated through her. Clara drew in a shaky breath, bracing herself for anger or accusation or the questions she had imagined 100 times. But when Luca finally spoke, his voice was low and ragged, the way it sounded only when he was more afraid than he wanted to admit. He asked if Eli was his son. She closed her eyes because it was too much to look at him and say the truth aloud. She nodded once, feeling her throat tighten until it almost hurt to breathe. When she opened her eyes again, she was startled to see that his face was wet with tears. She had never seen him cry, not even once, not in all the time they had shared, and the sight of it struck something inside her that she hadn't known was still alive. Eli, oblivious to the heaviness between them, looked up at Luca with frank curiosity. He asked if this was the man from the pictures, because in her weakest moments she had let herself show Eli a photograph she kept hidden in a drawer, a photo of Luca smiling in the bright Italian sun, back when she believed that smile was meant for her. She hadn't thought he remembered. Now, her heart squeezed as she tried to find the right words to soften the truth. But Luca crouched down so he was eye level with Eli and said in a voice that cracked that he was his father. Clara wanted to protest, to tell Luca he didn't get to claim that title after disappearing so completely, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was watch as Eli studied Luca's face with serious, searching eyes, as if trying to decide for himself whether to believe this stranger. When Eli finally reached out and rested a tentative hand on Luca's shoulder, she had to turn away because she couldn't bear to watch the past and the present collide so quietly, so inevitably. In that moment she understood that no matter how much she had tried to protect Eli from this day, it had always been coming. The past didn't stay buried. It waited, patient and relentless, until you were forced to stand in the middle of the street holding your child's hand while the man you once loved looked at you with every unspoken apology in the world shining in his eyes. And she realized that some part of her, some small, bruised, unkillable part, had been waiting too. The days after that first meeting unfolded in a haze of confusion and suspended disbelief that Clara hadn't felt since the night she'd left Luca behind. She told herself she was only allowing him into their lives because Eli deserved the truth and deserved the chance to know the man whose blood he carried, but every time she looked at Luca, she felt the old ache rise up again, fierce and familiar. She had forgotten how easy it was to fall into the rhythm of his voice, how quickly he could dissolve her careful defenses with a single unguarded look. But this time she didn't let herself be swept under. She reminded herself that she wasn't the same woman he had once loved, that her love for him had been buried under the years she spent learning to be strong alone. Luca didn't try to force anything. He came cautiously, always asking before he approached, always making sure Eli was comfortable. He brought small gifts, books and wooden puzzles and a stuffed bear that Eli immediately clutched to his chest as if it had always been his. He never tried to buy his way into their trust, and that was somehow worse, because it showed he had thought about what would matter to a child who didn't know him yet. Clara watched him with wary eyes, searching for the selfishness that had once defined so much of him, but she didn't see it in the way he tied Eli's shoelaces or in the way he knelt down to listen when Eli whispered secrets into his ear. One evening she found them sitting on the floor of Eli's room, a half-finished puzzle spread between them. The late afternoon sun slanted in golden stripes across Luca's bent head and Eli's small hands, and for a moment the sight of them together was so tender it made something splinter deep in her chest. She stood there unseen, listening to Luca's patient voice as he praised Eli's efforts, and she wondered what her life might have looked like if she had turned back that night instead of walking away. The thought was dangerous and seductive, but she didn't let herself stay in it. Regret was a luxury she couldn't afford, not now when she had fought so hard to build a life where her son would never have to doubt that he was wanted. As the weeks passed, Eli grew more at ease with Luca's presence. He started asking when his father would visit again, his eyes bright with anticipation. Clara told herself this was good, this was what Eli needed. But each time she watched Luca leave at the end of the evening, she felt the hollowness open up inside her again, because a part of her still wanted him to stay. She couldn't admit that to anyone, not even to herself in the quiet of night, but it was there, undeniable and alive, a small ember that refused to go out. Then, on a warm Saturday afternoon, Luca asked if he could take Eli to the park alone. The question was simple, but it landed like a stone in her chest. She wanted to say no, to keep her son close, but she looked into Eli's hopeful face and realized she had no right to let her fear decide for him. She nodded slowly, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack. She helped Eli into his little sneakers and kissed his hair, whispering to be good and to have fun, and then she watched them walk down the street together until they disappeared around the corner. She spent the next hour pacing the apartment, every sound from outside making her flinch. When the knock finally came, she almost ran to the door. Eli barreled into her arms, chattering about the ducks he'd fed and the ice cream Luca had bought him. Behind him, Luca stood quietly, his expression open in a way she'd never seen before. He thanked her for trusting him, his voice rough with emotion, and she felt herself soften despite everything. She stepped aside to let him in without thinking, and when their eyes met, she knew he understood how much that gesture cost her. That night, after Eli was asleep, she and Luca sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There were too many words, too much history pressed between them. Finally, Luca reached across the table and covered her hand with his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a slow, searching motion. He didn't ask for forgiveness, because he seemed to know she wasn't ready. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he said he was sorry for what he'd done, sorry for what he hadn't been brave enough to give, sorry for all the time they'd lost. She felt her throat tighten, and she looked away so he wouldn't see her eyes fill. When she finally met his gaze again, she didn't say she forgave him. She wasn't sure she ever fully would. But she said he could keep coming, that Eli deserved this, that maybe in time they could figure out what else was possible. Luca nodded, his jaw tight with the effort to hold back everything he still wanted to say. And in that fragile, imperfect moment, she realized that letting him in wasn't weakness. It was the first step towards something neither of them could yet name, something that might one day look a little like peace. I think the ending of this story is powerful because it doesn't pretend that love erases everything. It shows that even when time has passed and wounds have softened, trust doesn't simply spring back to life the moment someone says, "I'm sorry." Clara's choice to let Luca into Eli's life feels honest because it's not an easy reunion or a perfect redemption, it's a hard, cautious opening. What struck me most was that her forgiveness isn't automatic. She doesn't erase the pain he caused. She doesn't forget how lonely those years were. But she also doesn't let her anger close the door on what her child needs. That tension, between protecting herself and giving Eli the chance to know his father, feels so human and true. I also appreciate that Luca's regret isn't wrapped up in a neat bow. He doesn't arrive with grand gestures or declarations that make everything better. He shows up, again and again, in small ways that finally start to matter. That's more believable than any instant happily ever after. In the end, it's not about whether Clara and Luca will get back together. It's about her realizing that letting him share a piece of their son's life doesn't mean she's weak or naive. It means she's strong enough to choose what's best for her child, even when it costs her. And that quiet strength, more than any apology or reunion, is what makes the ending feel hopeful and real. The millionaire CEO was heading to the office, until he saw a little girl crying beside a broken bike, and something in her eyes stopped him cold. Noah Bennett's morning had begun like every other for the past 10 years, an early rise, black coffee in a stainless steel mug, and the quiet hum of his luxury car moving steadily through the city streets. He always walked the last block to the office, enjoying the illusion of still being part of the world outside his empire. With his crisp navy suit, neatly styled dark curls, and piercing blue eyes, he looked every bit the image of success. He had no patience for delays, detours, or distractions, his days were planned to the minute. The morning sun was already warming the pavement, and the scent of summer hung heavy in the air as he turned the corner, focused on the call he was about to join. That's when he saw her. At first, it was the flash of motion on the sidewalk ahead that caught his eye, something small and shaky, crouched beside a battered pink bicycle. Then he heard the muffled sound of crying. A little girl, no older than 6, sat hunched beside the bike, her face hidden behind large round glasses, her hands gripping the twisted handlebars. Her long, dark curls were tangled from sweat and tears, and her blue eyes, so startlingly familiar, were filled with frustration and heartbreak. Noah slowed to a stop, not because he planned to help, but because he couldn't look away. There was something about her face, the shape of her eyes, the way her expression crumpled as she wiped her tears on her sleeve, that tugged at something deep in his memory. He hesitated, glancing at his watch, then at the girl. His instincts told him to keep walking. This wasn't his business. He didn't stop for street drama or strangers in distress. But something about this child, the way she muttered to herself as she tried to fix the chain, the quiet determination behind her tears, held him in place. He crouched down a few feet away, keeping his voice low. "Hey," he said. "Are you okay?" The girl jumped slightly and looked up, clearly startled. She blinked behind her glasses, then sniffled. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed her. "My bike broke. I can fix it." Noah studied the bike. The chain was off, the front wheel bent, and one pedal was hanging by a thread. It was beyond a simple fix. "Looks like it needs a little more than a quick fix," he said gently. "Is your mom nearby?" The girl shook her head. "She's at work. I'm supposed to stay close to home. But I wanted to ride to the park. I didn't mean to go far." Her lip trembled, and she added softly, "She doesn't have money to get it fixed. So I thought maybe I could fix it myself." Noah felt a strange pressure in his chest, unfamiliar and tight. "Where's your dad?" he asked, not expecting the answer to matter. But her response stopped him cold. "I don't have one," she said simply. "Or maybe I do. I've never met him." He swallowed hard. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Sophie. Sophie Carter." The name hit him like a punch. Abby Carter. That name he hadn't thought about in years. A quiet intern he'd briefly dated before their lives drifted apart. He had never followed up, never asked questions, never thought to wonder what had come after. Now, here was Sophie. With blue eyes that looked like his. And a last name he couldn't ignore. Noah stood slowly, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he forgot about the call waiting on his phone, the deal he was supposed to close, and the perfectly crafted life that had seemed so complete, until this exact moment. Noah didn't remember making the decision to stay, but somehow he found himself sitting on the edge of the curb beside the little girl, watching her try once more to force the twisted pedal into place with her small, scraped fingers. She was determined, more than most adults he knew, and there was something both admirable and heartbreaking in the way she refused to give up even though it was clear she didn't have the tools, strength, or experience to fix it. He gently reached out and stopped her hand. "Hey," he said more softly this time, "why don't we take a break for a second? You've been working hard." Sophie looked at him with cautious eyes, as though unsure whether she should trust a stranger in a suit. But then her shoulders sagged a little and she let out a quiet breath, sitting back on the sidewalk, her legs crossed under her. "I just wanted to surprise Mom," she said finally. "I know she's tired, and if I got the bike working again, she wouldn't have to walk me everywhere." Noah was quiet, processing the weight behind such a simple statement. 6 years old, and already thinking about how to take pressure off her mother. He wondered what else she had been forced to carry without ever saying it out loud. He glanced down at the broken bike, then back at her. "Would it be okay if I helped?" he asked. "We could take it somewhere to get it fixed. My car's not far." She hesitated, looking at him like she was trying to see into his heart. Then she nodded. He led her carefully to his car parked just around the corner, and when he opened the back door and gently placed the broken bike inside, he noticed how she kept her hands on the door frame, as if ready to flee at any moment. He respected that. He didn't push her to talk, didn't ask questions about her mother, or pry into her life further. He just fastened her seatbelt and asked if she wanted a donut. Her nod was small, but hopeful. They stopped at a local cafe a few blocks away. He bought her a warm chocolate donut and an apple juice, and sat across from her at a quiet corner table while she cautiously took a bite. Noah didn't eat. He watched her instead, watching how she held the straw with both hands, how her gaze wandered to the window and then always came back to him, as if trying to decide whether this moment was real or temporary. After a few minutes, he finally asked the question that had been hovering between them since she said her full name. "Sophie," he said gently, "your mom's name is Abby, right?" She looked up, surprised, then nodded. "Yeah. Abby Carter. Do you know her?" He tried not to let emotion crack his voice. "I think I did. A while ago. Before you were born. She looked at him more carefully now, narrowing her eyes like a little detective. You work in an office? She asked. A big one? He smiled faintly. Yeah, I do. She told me, my dad worked in an office. I asked once. She didn't say much, just that he was busy and didn't know about me. But she said he wasn't mean. Just gone. Noah sat back in his chair, stunned by the simplicity of that explanation. Abby hadn't poisoned Sophie's mind with resentment. She had left the door open, even if only slightly. "Anne, do you ever think about him?" he asked cautiously. Sophie shrugged. Sometimes. But I don't miss him, because I never had him. I just think maybe, if he did know, he might have come. That sentence landed like a stone in Noah's chest. He had been that man. The one who didn't know. Or maybe the one who hadn't wanted to. He couldn't decide which was worse. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with corporate pressure or strategy. "Sophie," he said, slowly, "what if I told you I might be him?" She blinked, lips parting, but said nothing at first. Then she tilted her head, squinting at his face like she was comparing it to something in her memory. "You have the same eyes as me," she said quietly. "And the same nose." Noah let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The truth wasn't fully spoken yet, but it hung between them, warm and impossible to ignore. Sophie didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just looked at him, calm and direct, and asked, "Are you going to disappear again?" It was the hardest question anyone had ever asked him. And without hesitation, he gave her the only answer that mattered. "No," he said. "Not this time." The following morning, Noah couldn't sit still. He had spent most of the night replaying every moment with Sophie in his mind, the broken bike, her quiet strength, the way she had looked at him when she asked if he was going to disappear. He hadn't expected to feel so much, so fast, but something in her eyes had struck a chord that wouldn't stop ringing. It wasn't just guilt. It was something deeper, more primal. The realization that he had missed out on 6 years of her life, and that she had gone through all of it without him. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't planned for it, but now that she existed in his world, nothing else mattered the same way. Before the sun had fully risen, he was on his laptop, calling in favors and digging through old company files. It didn't take long to confirm that Abby Carter had worked in his firm during the time he remembered. She had left shortly after the end of their short relationship, and no one had heard from her since. She hadn't filed any complaints, hadn't asked for anything, not money, not support, not even a conversation. She had simply disappeared. That, more than anything, hit Noah the hardest. She hadn't made a scene or demanded accountability. She had just quietly raised a daughter on her own. And now, fate, or maybe something else, had placed Sophie directly in his path. He had no idea what Abby would say when she saw him. He didn't even know if she'd want him involved. But that didn't matter. She deserved to know what had happened. And Sophie deserved the truth, from both of them. He drove across the city to the hospital where Sophie had said Abby worked. It was still early, the sky just beginning to brighten with streaks of gold and gray. He walked into the hospital with the same focused energy he usually brought into boardrooms, but this time it was fueled by nerves, not confidence. He asked the woman at the front desk if Abby Carter was working that day. The receptionist checked a schedule, nodded, and pointed toward the 3rd floor. His hands were cold as he stepped into the elevator. When he reached the hallway, he paused before stepping forward. Through the small glass panel in one of the doors, he saw her. Abby. She was wearing scrubs, her hair tied back in a braid, her posture tired but upright as she reviewed a chart at the nurse's station. She hadn't changed much. The same warm skin tone, the same intelligent expression in her eyes, even if they were more worn now. There was strength in her presence, strength he hadn't appreciated back then. He took a breath and stepped forward. She turned just as he approached, and for a moment she didn't recognize him. Then her face changed, first confusion, then recognition, and then something harder to name. She straightened, setting the chart aside. Her voice was careful, quiet. "Noah." He nodded. "Hi, Abby." There was a long pause. He could feel the weight of it between them, thick with unspoken questions. She looked at him, arms crossed lightly, not hostile but wary. "What are you doing here?" "I met Sophie," he said simply. "Yesterday. She was trying to fix her bike. I stopped to help her. She told me your name, and I figured it out." Abby's expression flickered. She didn't answer right away. He could see her mind working, calculating, protecting, processing. Finally, she sighed. "She wasn't supposed to meet you like that." "I know," he said. "I didn't plan it. But now that I know, I couldn't walk away." Abby's eyes filled with something unreadable. "I never asked for anything, Noah. I didn't want to ruin your life or throw you into something you didn't choose. I raised her on my own because I thought that was best. I thought you'd moved on." "I had," he admitted. "Or I thought I had. But seeing her face, hearing her speak, it changed everything. I'm not here to take anything away. I just want to understand. And if you'll let me, I want to try to be part of her life." Abby looked down at her hands for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly. "She's not some project you can drop when things get hard. She's a person. A brilliant, kind, funny little person. And if you want to be in her life, it's not about promises to me. It's about showing up for her." "I know," he said. "And I'm not going anywhere this time." They stood in silence again, not quite reconciled, but no longer on opposite sides. Something had shifted, an opening, small but real. "I get off at 5, she said finally. "If you're serious, come by the apartment tonight. You can have dinner with us." And just like that, a door reopened. One he had once closed without even realizing it. When Noah showed up at Abby's apartment that evening, he wasn't sure what to expect. He had spent the entire afternoon in a haze of nervous energy, replaying every word they had exchanged at the hospital, questioning whether it had gone well or whether she had simply been too tired to say no. He stood in the dim hallway of her modest apartment building holding a paper bag with dinner from a local place he'd remembered she liked, unsure if it was a gesture too small, too late, or somehow both. The sound of children's laughter echoed faintly behind the door before he knocked. Sophie answered, her eyes lighting up in surprise when she saw him. "You came," she said, like she'd only half believed he would. Noah smiled and nodded, stepping inside when she stepped back. The apartment was warm and worn in, filled with the gentle clutter of a life built around love and limitation. Crayon drawings were taped to the fridge, a stack of library books sat by the couch, and the faint scent of something clean but old, like lavender and dust, lingered in the air. It was far from the sterile perfection of his penthouse, but it already felt more alive. Abby emerged from the small kitchen wiping her hands on a towel. She didn't smile, but she didn't look surprised either. "She told me you brought her donuts," she said as she walked past him to set the table. "You might have just become her favorite person." "I brought dinner," Noah offered, lifting the bag as if it were proof of good intentions. "Nothing fancy. Just what I remembered you liked." That made her pause for a second. "You remembered," she said, quiet, almost to herself. Then she nodded. "Okay. Thank you." They sat down at the small table, the three of them close together in the tight space. Sophie chattered as she ate, telling stories about school and how she'd almost won a race at recess. Noah listened, completely absorbed. It was the first time he had seen her like this, in her world, surrounded by the things and people that made her feel safe. He caught the way Abby's eyes softened when Sophie giggled, the way she instinctively reached to brush crumbs from her daughter's chin. Watching them together, he felt like a visitor to a place he should have always known. After dinner, Sophie pulled out her drawing pad and asked if Noah wanted to help her finish a picture she'd started earlier. He knelt beside her at the coffee table and did his best to sketch a clumsy version of their broken bike adventure. She laughed at how bad his wheels looked, and he pretended to be offended. Abby sat quietly on the couch, observing, her guard slowly lowering as she watched them bond. Once Sophie had gone to bed, after insisting Noah tuck her in too, Abby poured 2 cups of tea and joined him at the table again. The room was quieter now, and the weight of what still needed to be said hung between them. She looked at him seriously, her voice low. "Why now?" she asked. "After all this time, why show up now?" Noah didn't flinch. He had asked himself that question repeatedly since meeting Sophie. "Because I didn't know. And once I did, I couldn't ignore it. I've spent my whole life building things that don't matter the way she does. I don't expect you to trust me yet. But I'm here because I want to be her father. Not just by name. Really be there." Abby watched him closely. "And if she gets attached and you change your mind?" "I won't," he said. "I know I missed her first steps and her first words. But I won't miss anything else if you let me stay." She stared at him for a long time before nodding, slowly. "We'll take it one step at a time." That night, as he left the apartment, Noah stood in the hallway for a moment before heading down the stairs. For the first time in years, he felt like something had begun, not a deal, not a project, but a life. One that was no longer his alone. Noah had never known what it meant to be needed outside of the boardroom. In his professional life, every request came with a purpose, a number, or a bottom line. But with Sophie, everything was different. Her needs were never spoken in full sentences or requests typed in email threads, they came in glances, in the way she looked at him when she wasn't sure if he would show up again, in the way her little hand sometimes reached for his without a word. He had told Abby he would stay, and now he was doing exactly that. Every morning before work, he stopped by to walk Sophie to school. He had no idea how to braid hair or pack a school lunch, but he was learning. She showed him how to fold napkins into triangles and insisted he include a note every day, even if it was just a smiley face or the words, "Good luck," scribbled in his messy handwriting. She kept every one. Abby remained cautious, but there was a new softness between them. She still worked long shifts, and there were nights Noah came by just to help with dinner or cleaning or to keep Sophie company while Abby slept on the couch for a rare afternoon nap. He didn't try to take over, he just fit himself into the spaces they allowed him. The 3 of them had dinner together more often now, sometimes in his apartment, which he had begun childproofing bit by bit, amazed at how different it felt with crayon drawings taped to the fridge and a toy box near the couch. Sophie took to his space quickly, rearranging the furniture in tiny ways, placing her stuffed bear on his bed, lining her shoes next to his at the door, claiming little parts of his life like she belonged there. And the truth was, she did. One weekend, he picked her up early and surprised her with a trip to the park. She raced ahead of him with her new bicycle, not the broken one from the first day, but a shiny, sky blue bike he had helped her pick out. She still wore her glasses, now with a new pink frame that matched her helmet. As she zoomed along the path, Noah couldn't stop watching her, her freedom, her confidence, her laughter echoing through the trees. She didn't seem like a child who had grown up missing something. But he knew better. She had simply never let herself expect more. Later that afternoon, as they sat on the grass and shared a melting popsicle, Sophie looked up at him and asked, "Were you scared to be a dad?" The question caught him off guard. He didn't want to lie. "Yes," he said. "Very. I was scared I'd mess it up. That I wouldn't be good enough." She nodded, thoughtful. "I think you're good at it now," she said, and took another bite of popsicle. He laughed, feeling something inside him quietly break and rebuild all at once. He reached out and ruffled her curls, grateful she couldn't see how wet his eyes had suddenly become. That evening, when they returned to Abby's apartment, Sophie ran inside first, calling out about everything they had seen, the ducks at the lake, the ice cream stand, the way Noah almost fell trying to race her uphill. Abby smiled as she listened, watching them both. After Sophie went to bed, Noah lingered in the kitchen, helping wash dishes in silence until Abby finally spoke. "She's changed," she said. "She's happier. Braver." He looked at her, uncertain whether to respond. "It's not just you," she added, "but you're part of it." He didn't know how to reply, so instead he just nodded and dried the last plate. Before leaving, he paused at Sophie's bedroom door. She was already asleep, her new bear tucked under one arm, the note he had written that day pinned to her wall. He stood there for a moment, the quiet weight of fatherhood settling deeper into his bones. He had once believed that his life would always be defined by achievement, by status, by how many people depended on his decisions. But now he understood, what mattered most was this one small person, dreaming peacefully under a quilt her mother had stitched together piece by piece. And outside that room, a new kind of life was waiting for him. One he never thought he'd deserve, but one he now couldn't imagine losing. Noah hadn't realized just how much his life had changed until he found himself sitting in a small elementary school auditorium on a rainy Thursday evening, surrounded by folding chairs, handmade posters, and the hum of excited children waiting to perform in their end-of-year play. He was no longer glancing constantly at his phone or checking his watch. He was focused entirely on the stage, waiting to see Sophie appear in her little paper crown, dressed as a bike fairy in a story she had helped write. When her name was announced, he clapped louder than anyone, his heart swelling as she stepped onto the stage, her dark curls bouncing with every movement, her bright blue eyes scanning the crowd until they found him. The second she saw him, her entire face lit up. That one look erased any lingering doubt about his place in her life. She knew he was there. She expected him now. And he wouldn't fail her. After the play, they took photos with Abby, who had been able to trade shifts just in time to attend. She stood beside them, smiling shyly as Sophie demanded a picture with "both of my parents." It was the first time Sophie had said those words aloud in front of them, and they both paused at the sound of it. Abby didn't correct her. Noah didn't flinch. Instead, they exchanged a glance, quiet, cautious, but not uncertain. They were building something. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't fast, but it was real. Back at Noah's apartment, Sophie changed into her pajamas and danced around the kitchen while he heated up her favorite soup. Abby watched from the hallway, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed. Her eyes were tired, but there was a softness in her expression Noah hadn't seen before. When Sophie finally went to bed, hugging him tightly before disappearing into her room, Abby stayed behind in the living room. She sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap, and looked at Noah seriously. "She's happier than I've ever seen her," she said. "She trusts you." Noah sat across from her, his voice low. "I'll never take that for granted." "I mean that." Abby nodded, staring at the floor. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. I thought about telling you. So many times. But I was afraid you'd be angry. Or worse, you pretend to care, but then disappear anyway. So I didn't give you the chance." "I would have shown up," Noah said. "I know it sounds empty now, after everything. But I wish you had told me." "I don't regret raising her alone," Abby replied. "But I regret that she had to wait this long to know you. She deserved more." He couldn't argue. She was right. He had missed her first words, her first steps, her scraped knees, her birthday candles. But he was here now. And he would be here for everything else. The conversation shifted as the night deepened. They spoke honestly, without blame. They shared stories, memories of the short time they'd known each other before things fell apart. There was a tenderness between them now, not romantic yet, but open. They were no longer strangers connected by a child. They were partners in her life. Maybe more than that. Maybe not yet. As Abby stood to leave, Noah walked her to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob and looked up at him. "You're doing better than I thought you would," she said with a small smile. "She's lucky." "I think I'm the lucky one," he replied. After she left, he walked back to Sophie's room and peeked inside. She was asleep, her arm curled around her bear, the paper crown from the play resting on the nightstand beside her. He leaned against the doorframe and just watched her for a while, letting the silence settle into something peaceful. Noah had lived in penthouses, traveled on private jets, and signed deals that changed the course of industries. But nothing had ever grounded him like this small apartment with finger-painted drawings on the fridge and a little girl who called him "Daddy" without hesitation. And somewhere deep in his chest, a part of him finally started to believe that maybe he hadn't failed. Maybe he had just arrived late, to the only meeting that ever really mattered. The morning started like any other, with Noah packing Sophie's lunch while she drew flowers on sticky notes and Abby sipped her coffee with half-closed eyes at the kitchen table. The light poured in softly through the windows, and there was a peaceful rhythm to everything, a gentle choreography that had slowly formed between them over the last few weeks. But peace, Noah had learned, was fragile. Halfway through the morning, just as he dropped Sophie off at school and was turning back toward the parking lot, his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. Something in him knew before he answered that the day would not go as planned. The voice on the other end belonged to a nurse from the hospital where Abby worked. There had been an incident, a minor fall, they said, but she had blacked out for a moment and had been taken to the ER as a precaution. Noah felt the blood drain from his face. He was already back in the car before the call had ended, heart pounding, hands shaking slightly on the wheel. Memories flashed through his mind, how hard Abby worked, how little sleep she got, how many times she brushed off exhaustion like it was normal. He hadn't been there for her when she needed him most in the past, and the thought of failing her again filled him with a fear that knotted in his gut. At the hospital, he found her in a small exam room, pale but conscious, with a bruise already forming on her temple. She tried to sit up when he entered, but he rushed to her side and gently urged her back against the pillows. "It's nothing," she insisted, her voice hoarse. "I slipped on a wet floor. I just need to rest." But the doctors weren't so quick to dismiss it. They wanted to run tests, scans, blood work, the usual protocol, but Abby looked resistant, tense. Noah sat beside her and took her hand, not pressing, not demanding, but simply showing he was there. "Let them check everything," he said quietly. "Just in case. For Sophie." That changed her mind. She nodded, closed her eyes, and let them work. Hours passed, long and slow. Noah called the school to arrange for Sophie to stay with a teacher until he could get there. Then he waited. He didn't scroll through emails or take calls. For the first time, his business world felt like static noise he could finally tune out. All that mattered was behind that curtain, lying on a hospital bed, and the little girl who would be terrified if something truly happened to her mother. When the doctor returned with test results, his expression was calm, not urgent. Abby had low blood pressure and dehydration, likely brought on by overwork. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was a warning. Her body had been trying to keep going, and it had finally pushed back. Noah took Abby home that afternoon. She protested at first, insisting she could manage on her own, but he didn't leave room for argument. Sophie burst into tears when she saw her mom with a bandage on her head, clinging to her tightly. Noah explained everything gently, crouching down and letting Sophie cry into his shirt while Abby rested on the couch. That night, he cooked dinner, bathed Sophie, and even did a load of laundry in Abby's old washing machine that thumped louder than it spun. He stayed late, cleaning up quietly while Abby dozed under a blanket. Before he left, he stood at the doorway to her room. She was awake, watching him with tired eyes. "You didn't have to stay," she murmured. "I could have handled it." "No," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You shouldn't have to handle everything alone anymore." She didn't answer right away. Then she nodded, her eyes brimming with a different kind of exhaustion. One that had less to do with her body and more with years of doing it all herself. He walked over, gently kissed her forehead, and said, "Get some rest. I'll pick up Sophie from school tomorrow." As he let himself out, he realized that today had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Abby's fall had forced him to confront a truth he hadn't yet fully understood. This wasn't just about being present for Sophie. It was about being there for Abby too. She was more than the girl from his past. She was the woman who had carried the weight of their child, of her own life, of everything they should have shared. And now, he wanted to carry part of that weight. He drove home through quiet streets, the sky heavy with stars, and something settled deep inside him. A certainty. He loved them. Both of them. Not out of obligation or guilt or timing. But because, for the first time, he understood what it meant to belong somewhere, and to someone. Spring crept in gently, with soft breezes and longer days that made the world feel lighter. The weeks following Abby's fall had changed the rhythm of their lives in small but permanent ways. Noah began spending more nights at their apartment, not as a visitor but as someone who had found a place where he truly belonged. Sophie no longer asked if he was coming back each time he left, she knew he would. And Abby, slowly and cautiously, began to let down the guard she had carried for 6 years. The trust between them had grown out of shared effort, not promises. Every packed lunch, every ride to school, every load of laundry folded beside her in the evening chipped away at the distance that had once felt unbridgeable. One Saturday morning, while Sophie played in the park nearby, Abby and Noah sat on a bench under a budding tree. The sun warmed their shoulders and filled the silence between them with something tender. Abby turned to him with a look that was part amusement, part disbelief. "I used to think if I ever saw you again, it would be awkward. Angry, even. But now it just feels normal. Like this is what it was always supposed to be." Noah nodded, his eyes on Sophie as she chased after a butterfly with wild, uncoordinated leaps. "I thought I had everything I needed before," he said. "But now I can't imagine any of it without her, or without you." Abby smiled, not with hesitation this time, but with quiet warmth. "You didn't just show up for Sophie," she said. "You showed up for me, too. And I didn't realize how much I needed that until you did." That evening, they had dinner at Noah's apartment, his place, now transformed. The cold minimalism was gone, replaced with shelves filled with books and toys, throw blankets, a small table Sophie had painted with stars and scribbles, and a fridge covered in drawings. After dinner, Sophie disappeared into her room and returned wearing a fancy dress and a paper crown, declaring that tonight was family night. She had made decorations from construction paper and tape, and insisted they all sit on the floor with cookies and music. As they sat under a string of fairy lights Sophie had helped hang earlier that week, Noah watched Abby laugh, really laugh, for the first time in years. Her head tilted back, her eyes full of light. Sophie curled up in his lap, tired from too much dancing and sugar, and mumbled that this had been the best day of her whole life. Noah looked across at Abby, who was watching them with the kind of expression that said everything words never could. He reached for her hand, and she didn't hesitate. Their fingers intertwined naturally. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, Noah walked Abby to the door as he always did when she stayed late. But this time, she didn't reach for her coat. She stood quietly, watching him, then said, "I don't think I want to keep going back and forth. I think it's time we live like we belong to each other. Not just on weekends. Every day." He stepped closer, brushing a curl from her cheek. "You mean it?" She nodded. "We already are a family, Noah. Let's stop pretending it's temporary." They moved in together 2 weeks later. It wasn't dramatic or rushed, it was natural, inevitable, a home that grew from the inside out. Sophie helped pick the curtains. Abby organized the kitchen her way. Noah gave up his office to turn it into Sophie's art room. And life became something fuller than any of them had ever imagined. On a warm evening in early summer, the three of them sat on a picnic blanket by the lake. Sophie was drawing in her notebook, telling a long story about a superhero who fixed broken bikes with a single touch. Abby leaned her head on Noah's shoulder, and he kissed her forehead. "You know," he said, "I used to think success was about control, about having everything planned. But I've never felt more alive than I do when I have no idea what tomorrow looks like with you two." Abby smiled, her voice soft. "That's because for the first time, you're not running from anything. You're running toward it." And in that moment, with the sound of Sophie's laughter drifting on the breeze and the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold, Noah realized he hadn't just found love or redemption, he had found home. What makes the ending of this story so powerful is its quiet, earned transformation. It doesn't rely on dramatic revelations or sudden changes of heart, it shows growth through consistent presence, vulnerability, and the courage to repair what was once abandoned. Noah's journey from a distant, self-contained executive to a fully present father and partner feels not only believable, but deeply moving. He doesn't redeem himself through money or grand gestures, but through showing up every day, even when it's hard, even when trust takes time. The story reminds us that love isn't always loud, it's often built in quiet spaces, in packed lunches, bedtime stories, and slow forgiveness. That's what makes the ending feel so complete, not because everything is perfect, but because they chose each other, day after day.